Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Silent Stalker, a true 21st century haunting. Part 1. The mysterious text messages. In 2008, Lily Morgan, a university student living in the quiet town of Salem, Oregon, started experiencing something bizarre. It began with an innocuous text message, a random string of numbers and letters from an unknown number. Lily brushed it off as a mistake, possibly someone texting the wrong person. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of something far more sinister. Over the next few weeks, the messages kept coming. At first, they were short and cryptic, seemingly random words or letters that didn't make sense. But as time went on, the messages took on a disturbing new tone. They started containing details about Lily's life. They mentioned what she was wearing, where she had been that day, and even what she had eaten for breakfast. At first, Lily was confused. She wasn't particularly active on social media, and she couldn't think of anyone who would be playing this kind of joke on her. The precision of the details unnerved her. She didn't tell anyone at first, thinking it was just a harmless prank. But as the days turned into weeks, the messages grew more frequent, more detailed, and more personal. One evening, while she was heading back to her apartment after a late-night study session at the university library, her phone buzzed with another text message. She glanced down and froze when she saw the words on the screen, "I see you." Her blood turned to ice. She stopped dead in her tracks and looked around, but there was no one there. The street was deserted, and the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Her heart pounded in her chest as her hands began to tremble. Lily turned on her heel and hurried the rest of the way home, locking the door behind her as soon as she stepped inside. That night, she barely slept. Every noise in her apartment seemed magnified. Every creak and groan of the old building felt like an intrusion. The overwhelming sense of being watched wouldn't leave her. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just a prank or some kind of mistake, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, the messages escalated. They began predicting her movements. Going to class now, the text would read, just as she stepped out of her apartment. "Hope you enjoyed the coffee," it said after she returned from the cafe near her school. The person sending the messages seemed to be getting closer, more intimate with the details of her life. Finally, Lily went to the police, but they were dismissive. They assumed it was just someone from her social circle playing a cruel joke. They suggested changing her phone number, which she did, hoping it would be the end of the harassment. But within days, the messages found her again. It was clear whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. Part 2. The Man in the Window. Months passed, and the eerie text messages became part of Lily's daily life. She had developed a constant sense of paranoia. She stopped going out at night, began avoiding social interactions, and even considered moving, but her meager student budget made that impossible. One rainy November evening, Lily was sitting on her couch, trying to focus on her coursework. She had grown accustomed to ignoring the texts, although the unnerving feeling of being watched never really left her. As she worked, she heard a tapping noise. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, more persistent. The sound was coming from her bedroom window. Lily's apartment was on the 3rd floor, making it impossible for anyone to be standing outside her window. Or so she thought. Heart racing, she approached the window cautiously. As she pulled back the curtain, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing across the street, was a man. He was tall and dressed in all black, his face obscured by the hood of his coat. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted up towards her window, as though he was watching her. Her phone buzzed again. Another text, "Do you see me?" Lily backed away from the window, her pulse pounding in her ears. She fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she tried to explain the situation to the operator. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The officers searched the area but found no trace of the mysterious figure. They assured Lily that it was probably just someone passing by and that there was no real danger. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. That night, she slept with the lights on, jumping at every small noise. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart would stop for a split second. The messages weren't just random anymore, they were a form of control. And the man outside her window proved that whoever was behind this was closer than she'd ever imagined. Part 3. The Whispering Calls. The text messages had been terrifying, but when the phone call started, everything got worse. It began a week after she had seen the man in the street. Lily's phone rang in the middle of the night, jarring her awake from a fitful sleep. She groggily answered it, assuming it was a wrong number, but there was no response on the other end, just silence, followed by faint, labored breathing. She hung up, unnerved but not entirely alarmed. But the calls kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Sometimes the person on the other end would whisper. It wasn't clear words, more like a garbled, distorted sound, like someone was trying to speak through a bad connection. One night, as Lily sat in her apartment, her phone rang again. She didn't want to answer it, she was sick of the harassment, but something compelled her to pick up. This time, the whispering was louder, clearer. It was a rhythmic, almost chant-like murmuring that made her skin crawl. She strained to make out the words, but all she could hear were fragments ... watching ... closer ... Her hands shook as she hung up the phone. She felt like she was losing her mind. Who was doing this? Why? She hadn't told anyone about the calls or the texts. No one in her life seemed to believe her when she mentioned the strange occurrences, and even she had started doubting herself. Could this be her imagination? Or was someone really watching her every move? The police, once again, were no help. Without solid evidence, they dismissed it as a prank, suggesting she blocked the number. But Lily knew it was more than just a prank. There was something dark and malevolent lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The phone calls became more frequent. Sometimes the caller would say nothing at all, just silence on the other end, broken only by that chilling, steady breathing. Other times, the whispers would return, growing louder and more menacing. It felt like someone was trying to break through to her, to communicate something unspeakable. But what? Part 4. The Sleepless Nights. By the time December rolled around, Lily's life had completely unraveled. She had stopped going to class altogether, terrified of leaving her apartment and being watched. She avoided going out during the day and refused to leave her home at night. Her once peaceful sanctuary had become a prison, and she was its only captive. The texts and calls continued, each one driving her deeper into paranoia. The whispers in the phone calls became more coherent, and Lily swore she could hear her name being spoken in that distorted, crackling voice. She had stopped answering the phone, but the messages still came, always finding a way to remind her that she was never alone. Sleep was no longer an option. Every noise, every shadow became a potential threat. The creaking of the old apartment building was no longer just the natural settling of wood. It was the sound of someone creeping through the halls. The darkness outside her window felt oppressive, like it was hiding something terrible, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One night, Lily woke up in the middle of the night to find her bedroom window wide open. She was certain she had locked it before going to bed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, her eyes darting around the room. Then her phone buzzed. She didn't want to look, but her hands moved on their own. It was a photo of her, taken from outside the window while she was sleeping. Lily screamed. Throwing the phone across the room, she raced to the window, slamming it shut and locking it with trembling hands. She was shaking uncontrollably, her mind racing with fear and confusion. How had someone gotten so close? Who was doing this to her? Part 5. The disappearing friend. Lily's isolation grew unbearable. Desperate for help, she finally reached out to her closest friend, Clara, the only person she trusted enough to confide in. Clara had always been supportive, and when she heard the full extent of what was happening, she didn't hesitate to come over. For the first time in weeks, Lily felt a brief sense of safety with someone else in the apartment. They spent the night discussing what had been going on, trying to piece together any logical explanation for the harassment. Clara suggested that Lily move out, but Lily was too frightened to leave. She felt trapped, as if the stalker was watching her every move. At some point, exhaustion took over, and the two friends fell asleep on the couch. But when Lily woke up the next morning, Clara was gone. At first, Lily assumed Clara had left for work, but when she called her, the phone went straight to voicemail. Clara's phone was never off, so this immediately sent alarm bells ringing in Lily's mind. She called and called, but there was no answer. As the hours passed, worry turned into panic. Clara's family hadn't heard from her either, and when Lily explained what had happened to them, they contacted the police. A missing persons report was filed, but days went by with no sign of Clara. Lily was consumed by guilt, convinced that whatever had been stalking her had now taken her friend. As the days turned into weeks, the messages continued. But now, they were different. The texts started mentioning Clara. "Where's your friend?" one read. Another simply said, "You're next." Lily was terrified. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was behind the messages had something to do with Clara's disappearance, and they were taunting her with it. Part 6. The Vanishing Presence. After Clara's disappearance, Lily's world unraveled even faster. The police investigation seemed to stall, with no leads or clues pointing to what had happened to her friend. The disappearance was labeled as a missing persons case, but Lily knew in her gut that Clara hadn't simply walked away. The haunting texts and phone calls never stopped, and now they seemed even more personal, more targeted. One evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Lily sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the curtains tightly drawn. She hadn't been outside in days, her fear trapping her in the suffocating space that used to be her home. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. But in her mind, the silence was deafening. Each second ticking away reminded her of how long Clara had been gone. Her phone buzzed once again, pulling her from the dark thoughts. With shaking hands, she picked it up. This time there was no text, just a voicemail. Her heart thudded in her chest as she listened to the distorted voice on the other end. "Do you want to know where she is?" The voice was slow, almost mocking, with that same eerie distortion she had come to dread. Her breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. The room spun around her, and she fought the overwhelming urge to throw her phone across the room. She immediately called the police, desperate to get them to trace the number or do anything to find Clara. But when the officers arrived at her apartment, they found no new evidence. The number was untraceable, and the voicemail was dismissed as another sick prank. Lily was losing faith in the police, and worse, she was losing faith in her own sanity. The nightmares that plagued her sleep now seeped into her waking hours. She began hearing things, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper in the back of her mind, calling her name, reminding her of Clara's absence. One night, as she lay in bed, tossing and turning, her phone buzzed once more. This time, the message was simple: "Come find me." Lily's blood ran cold. The message was accompanied by an address, an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, one she knew well. It was the old hospital where her grandmother had worked as a nurse before it closed down in the late 90s. It had been shuttered for years, but rumors surrounded the place, stories of hauntings, strange sightings, and disappearances. Part 7. The Hospital. The abandoned hospital stood like a forgotten relic on the edge of town, its crumbling exterior barely visible in the dim moonlight. The windows were broken, the doors boarded up, and the once pristine grounds were now overrun with weeds and decay. This was the last place Lily ever wanted to go, but the message had left her no choice. She had to find Clara. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her phone, Lily made her way to the hospital under the cover of darkness. Every step toward the building felt heavier than the last, as though an invisible force was pulling her back, warning her to stay away. But she couldn't. Clara's life depended on it. As she approached the front entrance, her heart pounded in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as she pushed it open. The stench of mold and rot hit her like a wave, and she gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve. The air inside was heavy and cold, far colder than the night outside, as if the building itself were holding on to some ancient, chilling secret. The interior was worse than she had imagined. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was littered with debris. Old hospital equipment lay scattered around, rusting and broken, like the remains of some forgotten time. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the soft scuffling of her own footsteps. Lily's flashlight flickered as she made her way down the long, dark corridor. Every sound seemed amplified: the drip of water from a cracked ceiling, the creak of floorboards as she walked, the soft hum of wind blowing through broken windows. But there was something else, too, a faint, distant noise that sent chills down her spine. She paused, straining to listen. It was a voice. A faint, barely audible whisper, coming from deeper within the building. Lily. Her heart stopped. It was Clara's voice. Lily's breath quickened, and without thinking, she moved faster down the hallway, following the sound. It grew louder, more distinct, but it was still faint, like it was being carried on the wind. "Help me," the voice said again, closer now. Lily's mind raced. Could Clara really be here? Was this some kind of twisted game? She didn't know, but she couldn't stop now. She had to find her friend. The whispering led her deeper into the hospital, through a series of dark, maze-like hallways. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air grew colder with every step. She felt as though she was walking into a trap, but she couldn't turn back. Not now. Finally, she reached a set of heavy, rusted doors. The whispering was coming from beyond them. Part 8. The basement. Lily hesitated for a moment before pushing the doors open. They groaned on their hinges, the sound echoing down the hallway like a scream. Beyond the doors was a set of stairs leading down into what appeared to be the hospital's basement. The darkness below was thick and impenetrable, her flashlight barely illuminating the steps ahead. Clutching the light, she descended, her breath shaky and her heart pounding louder than ever. The whispering continued, urging her forward, pulling her deeper into the bowels of the building. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The basement was vast, far larger than she had expected. Old hospital beds were pushed against the walls, covered in grime and dust. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and she gagged again, struggling to keep her composure. She heard the whisper once more, louder this time, coming from one of the rooms ahead. With trembling hands, she pushed open the door to the room where the sound was coming from. The room was empty, save for a single hospital bed in the center. On it lay a figure, shrouded in shadows, barely moving. Clara. Lily's voice was barely a whisper as she stepped closer. The figure didn't respond. Her heart raced as she approached the bed. It was Clara. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and gaunt. She looked almost dead. Lily reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched Clara's cold hand. At that moment, Clara's eyes shot open, wide and unblinking. But the eyes that stared back at Lily weren't Clara's. They were dark, hollow, filled with an unnatural, malevolent force. Part 9. The Encounter. Lily stumbled back in horror, her heart nearly stopping as Clara's body convulsed violently. A guttural, inhuman growl erupted from her throat, filling the room with a sound that was not of this world. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, Clara's body was twisted in an unnatural position, her limbs contorted as though something inside her was trying to break free. Her face was no longer her own, her eyes were black as coal, her skin pale and stretched, her mouth twisted into a grotesque, unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come." The voice that came from Clara's mouth wasn't her own. It was deeper, distorted, like multiple voices speaking in unison. Lily backed away, her mind reeling with terror. This wasn't Clara. This was something else, something dark and evil that had taken her place. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside the room with the entity that had once been her friend. The air grew thick with a suffocating, malevolent presence, and the temperature dropped even further, her breath visible in the freezing air. The figure on the bed stood up, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it wasn't fully in control of the body it inhabited. The growling continued, louder and more menacing with each passing second. Lily's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She was frozen in place, her body paralyzed by fear as the entity slowly moved toward her. Part 10. The final revelation. Lily's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed into the corner of the room, her mind racing for any way out. The entity, no longer Clara, advanced slowly, its twisted smile widening as it drew closer. Then, without warning, the lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into complete darkness. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, from the darkness, the voice spoke again. "You were always the target." A cold realization washed over Lily. This thing, whatever it was, had never been after Clara. It had been after her all along. The texts, the phone calls, the stalking, it had all been leading to this moment. The entity had lured her here, into the heart of the haunted hospital, where it had been waiting. Her hands fumbled in the dark, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against a cold, metal object, a discarded scalpel. With trembling hands, she gripped it tightly, her only hope of survival. Suddenly, the entity lunged at her, its grotesque form moving faster than she could react. Lily swung the scalpel wildly, slashing at the darkness in front of her. She felt the blade connect with something solid, followed by an ear-piercing scream that filled the room. The lights flickered back on, and the entity was gone. Lily stood in the center of the room, panting and covered in sweat. The hospital bed was empty, and the door was wide open. The nightmare was over, or so she thought.